It begins with a question that has been asked for centuries, a question that continues to shape how millions of people understand faith, identity, and truth, and that question is simple on the surface but deeply complex in its meaning. Who was Jesus? Was he God, or was he a messenger sent by God? And the way this question is answered does not only affect belief, it affects how people see the entire structure of religion itself. In many parts of the world, Jesus is seen as divine, as part of God, as something beyond human limitation, but in another understanding, one that is rooted in strict monotheism, he is seen differently, not as God, not as a part of God, but as a human being chosen for a mission, a prophet sent with guidance, a messenger who called people back to the worship of one God. To understand this perspective, we must first return to a principle that stands at the center of monotheistic belief, the idea that God is one, absolute, without partner, without division, without any form that resembles creation. And this principle is not a small detail, it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. If God is truly one and unlike anything in creation, then the idea of God becoming human or sharing divinity with a human form raises questions that cannot be ignored within this framework. Because a human being by nature eats, sleeps, feels pain, depends on the world around him, and these are qualities of creation, not qualities of the Creator. This is where the understanding of Jesus as a prophet becomes clear, because in this view, his greatness does not come from being God, it comes from being chosen by God, from being given a message, from being supported with miracles, and from living a life that called people toward truth. His birth itself is seen as a sign, a miracle that points to God's power, not to his own divinity, because if a miraculous birth were enough to make someone divine, then other figures in history would carry the same status. Yet the message remains consistent. Miracles are signs, not proof of being God. Throughout his life, Jesus spoke, taught, guided, and called people toward something greater than himself. He did not call people to worship him, but to worship God. He did not present himself as the source of power, but as a servant carrying a message. And this distinction is important, because it separates the messenger from the one who sent the message. A messenger delivers truth, but he is not the origin of that truth, and this is how he is understood within this perspective, as a bridge between humanity and divine guidance, not as the destination of worship. It is also important to understand how language and interpretation can shape belief over time, because words carry meaning, and meaning can shift depending on how those words are understood. Terms like son or spirit can be interpreted in different ways, sometimes metaphorically, sometimes literally, and when interpretations change, beliefs can follow, and over generations these interpretations can become established, accepted, and deeply rooted within communities. But when we step back and return to the core message of monotheism, the idea of absolute oneness, the understanding of Jesus as a prophet aligns consistently with that foundation. This does not reduce his importance, it elevates it in a different way, because being chosen as a prophet is not a small role, it is a position of trust, responsibility, and honor. It means carrying a message that guides people, it means standing firm in truth even when facing rejection, and it means being an example for others to follow. His life, his teachings, his character, all of these become meaningful not because he is worshipped, but because he points beyond himself, toward the one who deserves worship. And when we look at it from this perspective, the question begins to shift. It is no longer only about whether he was God or not, it becomes about understanding the role he played, the message he carried, and the purpose behind his mission. Because if his mission was to guide people to God, then the focus naturally returns to that central belief, the oneness of God, the foundation that connects everything within this understanding. This is where the clarity begins to form, not through argument, not through rejection of others, but through a consistent principle that remains unchanged, that God is one, that he does not become creation, that he does not share his essence, and that those who are sent are servants, honored, respected, but still human, still part of creation, still carrying a message rather than being the source of it. And understanding this does not close the conversation, it opens it in a different way, because once we understand how this perspective sees Jesus, we can begin to explore how other perspectives developed, how interpretations changed, and how history shaped what people believe today. But before all of that, this foundation must be clear, because without it, the rest of the discussion loses its direction. And so the story begins here, not with division but with understanding, with a return to the core principle of oneness, and with a recognition of Jesus not as God, but as a messenger who called people toward God, a role that carries its own depth, its own meaning, and its own place within the larger story of faith. As we move forward from understanding Jesus as a messenger within a strictly monotheistic framework, the next step is not to argue, but to understand how a different conclusion emerged, because beliefs do not appear suddenly, they develop over time, shaped by language, interpretation, history, and the way communities preserve and explain what they inherit. In many parts of the world today, Jesus is understood as divine, as more than a prophet, as someone who shares in the nature of God, and this belief did not form in a single moment, it unfolded gradually, influenced by how his life, his words, and his mission were interpreted by those who came after him. To understand this development, it is important to recognize that the earliest followers of Jesus lived in a world where religious language often carried symbolic meaning, where titles could express closeness, honor, or spiritual rank rather than literal identity. Terms such as son were not always used in a biological or literal sense. They could also indicate a special relationship, a closeness to God, a chosen status, and this type of language existed within the broader religious culture of the time. But as this language moved across generations and into different regions, especially into societies with different philosophical backgrounds, the way these terms were understood began to shift. As communities expanded beyond their original context, they encountered new cultures, new ideas, and new systems of thought, and among these were philosophical traditions that approached questions of existence, nature, and divinity in different ways. Concepts about the nature of being, the relationship between the divine and the human, and the idea of manifestation or embodiment became part of how some people began to interpret religious teachings. Over time, these influences interacted with the message of Jesus, shaping how his role was understood in ways that went beyond the original context. Another important factor in this process was the passage of time itself, because as generations move further away from an event, they rely more on interpretation than direct experience. The companions of a prophet understand him through direct interaction, through lived experience, but later generations understand through reports, through teachings that have been passed down, and through explanations given by scholars and leaders. This distance naturally introduces variation, not necessarily through intention, but through the complexity of preserving meaning across time. At the same time, debates began to arise within early communities about how to understand the nature of Jesus, and these debates were not simple. They were complex discussions about identity, about divinity, about how to reconcile belief in one God with the elevated status that Jesus clearly held. Different groups offered different explanations, some maintaining a purely prophetic understanding, others moving toward a more elevated interpretation, and over time, certain views became more widely accepted within specific communities. Historical events also played a significant role, because when religious ideas become connected with political authority or institutional structures, they can become formalized, defined, and established as official belief. Councils, discussions, and decisions contributed to shaping how doctrine was understood and taught, and once a belief becomes part of an established structure, it is passed on as a foundation, something that future generations accept as given rather than question from the beginning. It is important to understand that for those who hold this belief, it is not seen as contradiction. It is seen as truth, as a way of honoring Jesus, as a way of expressing his importance and uniqueness. This perspective does not come from a desire to divide, but from a sincere attempt to understand who he was and what his role meant. And recognizing this sincerity is important, because it allows the conversation to remain grounded in understanding rather than turning into conflict. At the same time, when we return to the principle of absolute oneness, the idea that God is completely separate from creation, that he does not take human form, that he does not share his essence, the understanding of Jesus as a prophet remains consistent within that framework. The differences, then, are not about denying his importance, but about defining his nature in a way that aligns with how God is understood. This is where the contrast becomes clearer, not as a clash, but as two different approaches to the same figure, one emphasizing divine nature, the other emphasizing prophetic role, one interpreting certain terms in a literal sense, the other understanding them metaphorically within the context of language and tradition. And both of these approaches developed over time, shaped by the environments in which they grew. Understanding this process does not require agreement, but it requires awareness, because without understanding how these perspectives formed, it becomes easy to reduce the conversation to simple statements, when in reality, it is the result of centuries of thought, interpretation, and historical development. And when we take the time to see that process clearly, the discussion becomes more meaningful, more grounded, and more complete. As we continue forward, the focus will move toward examining these differences more closely, not to create division, but to understand where they come from and how they influence belief today, because only by understanding both the origin and the development can we fully understand the present. And at this stage, what matters most is clarity about the principles that guide each perspective, clarity about how interpretations formed, and clarity about the fact that behind these differences are sincere attempts to understand something profound, the nature of a figure whose impact continues to shape the beliefs of millions around the world. And with that clarity, the story continues not with judgment but with deeper understanding, moving step by step through the layers that have formed over time, always returning to the question at the center, not just who Jesus was, but how and why people came to understand him in different ways. As we move deeper into this discussion, the focus begins to narrow toward the point where these two perspectives truly separate, not in emotion, not in respect for Jesus, but in how his nature is defined and understood at its core, because while both views acknowledge his importance, his role, and his impact, they differ in one central question: is he to be understood as divine, or as a human messenger chosen by God? And this question is not a small detail, it shapes everything that comes after. It influences how worship is directed, how prayer is understood, and how the relationship between the human and the divine is defined. In one understanding, divinity is shared, expressed through a concept that allows for multiple aspects within one God, while in the other, divinity remains absolute, singular, without division, without any form of sharing, and this difference is where the line becomes clear. When we return to the principle of absolute oneness, the idea that God is unlike anything in creation, that he does not resemble human beings, that he is not subject to human limitations, the understanding of Jesus as a human messenger becomes not only consistent, but necessary within that framework, because if God is beyond all human qualities, then the idea of God entering human form, experiencing hunger, fatigue, or dependence, creates a contradiction that cannot be resolved within that understanding. A messenger, however, fits naturally into this structure because a messenger carries the message, but does not become the source of it. He is chosen, guided, supported, but remains distinct from the one who sent him. This distinction becomes even clearer when we look at the role of worship, because worship is directed toward the ultimate source, toward the one who created, who sustains, who controls all things, and if Jesus is understood as a messenger, then worship remains directed toward God alone, without any intermediary being the object of that worship. This preserves a direct relationship between the human and the divine, one that does not require any form of shared divinity, one that remains centered on the oneness of God as the sole object of devotion. At the same time, it is important to understand that those who see Jesus as divine do not necessarily see this as contradiction, but as a mystery, as something that goes beyond human logic, a concept that cannot be fully explained but is accepted as part of belief. This approach allows for a different kind of understanding, one that is not limited by the same framework of strict separation between creator and creation. And this is where the difference becomes not only theological but also philosophical, because it reflects two different ways of approaching the idea of God, one that emphasizes absolute transcendence, and another that allows for a form of immanence. But when we remain within the framework of strict monotheism, the clarity of the prophetic understanding stands out, because it maintains a consistent definition of God across all aspects of belief. It avoids any form of division, it keeps the line between creator and creation clear, and it places every prophet, including Jesus, within a role that is defined by service, by mission, and by guidance rather than by divinity. This does not reduce the status of Jesus, it defines it in a way that aligns with the core principle that governs everything else. Another important aspect to consider is how Jesus himself is understood through his actions and words, because within this perspective, his life reflects the role of a messenger, someone who prays, who calls upon God, who seeks guidance, who teaches others to turn toward God, and these actions are seen as evidence of his position, not as God, but as a servant of God. The distinction here is not based on interpretation alone, it is also based on how these actions are understood within the framework of belief. Over time, as these two perspectives became more defined, they also became more established within their respective communities, taught from generation to generation, reinforced through tradition and integrated into the identity of those who follow them. And once a belief becomes part of identity, it becomes something that is not easily questioned, not easily changed, because it is no longer only about understanding, it is about belonging, about continuity, about maintaining a connection to what has been passed down. Yet even with these differences, there remains a shared respect for Jesus across both perspectives, a recognition of his importance, his influence, and his role in guiding people toward truth. The difference lies not in whether he is respected, but in how his nature is defined, and this distinction is what shapes the entire discussion. As we continue to explore this topic, it becomes clear that understanding these differences requires more than simply stating them, it requires seeing the frameworks behind them, the principles that guide them, and the reasons why they developed the way they did. Because without that understanding, the discussion remains on the surface, focused only on conclusions rather than on the reasoning that leads to them. And this is where the conversation begins to deepen, moving beyond simple labels and into a more structured understanding of belief, where each perspective is seen within its own context, where differences are not only identified but explained, and where the goal is not to create division, but to bring clarity to a question that has shaped the understanding of faith for generations. At this stage, the contrast is clear, but the purpose is not conflict, it is understanding, because only through understanding can we move forward into a more complete picture, one that acknowledges the differences while also recognizing the shared elements that still exist beneath them. And with that clarity, the next step becomes possible, to look even closer at how these beliefs influence practice, how they shape the way people live, worship, and understand their relationship with God, because belief is not only something that is thought, it is something that is lived, and the way it is lived reflects the way it is understood. And so the journey continues not as an argument, but as an exploration, moving step by step through the layers of belief, always returning to the central question, and always seeking to understand it with clarity, depth, and awareness. As the discussion moves into a deeper stage, the focus begins to shift from abstract ideas into how belief actually shapes practice, because what people believe is not only something held in thought, it is something that directly influences how they live, how they pray, how they understand their relationship with God. And this is where the difference between seeing Jesus as a messenger and seeing him as divine becomes more visible in everyday life. Belief is not isolated, it flows into action, and action reflects belief. So when the understanding of who Jesus is changes, the structure of worship, the direction of devotion, and the nature of prayer also change in response. In a framework where Jesus is understood as a prophet, worship remains directed entirely and exclusively to God, without any form of shared focus, because the role of a prophet is to guide people toward God, not to become an object of worship himself. This creates a direct connection, a relationship that does not involve intermediaries as objects of devotion, a relationship where the human turns directly to the Creator, seeking guidance, forgiveness, and support without directing worship toward any created being. The prophet in this structure is honored, respected, followed, but never worshipped, because his role is to point beyond himself, not to become the center of devotion. This understanding also shapes the way prayer is viewed, because prayer becomes a direct conversation between the individual and God, without any need for a shared divine nature or a human form through which divinity is accessed. The simplicity of this structure is part of its strength. It maintains clarity, it avoids complexity, and it keeps the focus on a single, absolute source. In this way, belief and practice remain aligned, reinforcing each other in a consistent and unified way. In contrast, when Jesus is understood as divine, the structure of belief naturally leads to a different expression of worship, because if he is seen as sharing in divinity, then the relationship between the human and the divine can include him as part of that connection. This does not necessarily remove the belief in one God within that perspective, but it introduces a different understanding of how that oneness is expressed, allowing for a more complex structure that includes multiple aspects within a single divine reality. As a result, prayer, devotion, and spiritual focus can take forms that reflect this understanding. It is important to recognize that for those who hold this view, it is not seen as division, but as a complete expression of belief, something that has been developed, explained, and preserved over time within their own framework. And this again highlights the importance of understanding, because without understanding the internal logic of each perspective, it becomes easy to see only the difference without seeing the reasoning behind it. At the same time, when we return to the principle of absolute oneness, the understanding of Jesus as a prophet continues to align with that principle in a direct and consistent way, because it maintains a clear distinction between creator and creation, it avoids any blending of roles, and it keeps the structure of worship focused entirely on God alone. This clarity is what defines the simplicity of this approach, a simplicity that is not a lack of depth, but a reflection of a foundational principle that governs everything else. Another important aspect to consider is how belief influences identity, because over time, the way people understand Jesus becomes part of how they define themselves, part of their religious identity, part of their connection to their community and their tradition. And when belief becomes identity, it is no longer just an idea, it becomes something that people live by, something they defend, something they pass on to future generations. This is why differences in belief are not only intellectual, they are also deeply personal, connected to how people see themselves and their place within a larger story. Yet even within these differences, there remains a shared recognition of Jesus as a significant and honored figure, someone whose life and message carry meaning, someone who is connected to divine guidance in a way that sets him apart from ordinary individuals. The difference is not in whether he is respected, but in how his nature is understood, and that distinction continues to shape both belief and practice. As we look at this stage more closely, it becomes clear that belief is not only about defining concepts, it is about creating a structure that guides life, that shapes how people approach the world, how they understand purpose, how they connect with the divine, and how they live out their faith on a daily basis. And because belief shapes practice so directly, differences in belief naturally lead to differences in practice, not as an intention to separate, but as a reflection of how each perspective understands its foundation. Understanding this relationship between belief and practice is essential, because it shows that differences are not isolated, they are part of a larger system. A system that includes thought, action, identity, and tradition, all connected to each other in a continuous cycle. And when we see this system clearly, we begin to understand that the differences we observe today are the result of a long process, one that has developed over time, shaped by interpretation, shaped by history, and shaped by the way each community has carried its beliefs forward. At this point in the journey, the distinction between the two perspectives is fully visible, not only in theory but in lived experience, in how people pray, how they worship, how they understand their connection to God, and how they express that connection in their daily lives. And this visibility is important, because it moves the discussion from abstract ideas into real-world understanding, into something that can be seen, felt, and experienced. But even here, the purpose is not to create division, it is to create clarity, because clarity allows for understanding, and understanding allows for a more balanced view of the subject, one that recognizes both the differences and the reasoning behind them. As the discussion continues, the next step will move toward bringing all of these elements together, not to simplify them, but to understand how they connect within the larger picture, because only by seeing the full picture can we truly understand the depth of this topic and the reasons why it continues to be relevant across time. And so the journey moves forward, building on what has been understood so far, step by step, layer by layer, always returning to the central question, always seeking clarity, and always aiming to understand not only what people believe, but why they believe it and how that belief shapes everything else. As the discussion reaches this stage, the focus begins to shift from examining differences to understanding what lies beneath them, because after exploring how beliefs formed, how interpretations developed, and how those interpretations shape practice, there comes a moment where everything points toward a deeper question, not only how people differ in understanding Jesus, but what remains constant despite those differences, what continues to exist beneath the layers of interpretation, history, and identity. And this is where the perspective begins to change, because when we look beyond the surface, we begin to see that even in disagreement, there are shared elements that have never disappeared. Across different understandings, there is still a recognition of God as the ultimate source, as the creator, as the one who holds power over existence. And while the nature of that understanding may differ in expression, the central idea of divine authority remains present. There is also a shared acknowledgement that Jesus was not an ordinary individual, that his life, his message, and his role carry significance, that he was connected to divine guidance in a way that sets him apart, and this shared recognition forms a point of connection, even when interpretations of his nature are not the same. At the same time, there is a shared sense of purpose behind his mission, because regardless of how his nature is defined, he is seen as someone who called people toward something greater than themselves, someone who guided, who taught, who challenged people to reflect on their lives and their relationship with God. This idea of guidance, of calling people toward truth, is consistent, even if the details of belief differ. And this consistency reflects something deeper than variation. It reflects a shared understanding of the role that such a figure plays within faith. There is also a shared emphasis on values, because when we move away from theological definitions and look at the teachings themselves, we find recurring themes of compassion, humility, responsibility, and accountability, themes that appear across traditions, shaping how people are taught to live and how they are encouraged to treat others. These values are not tied to one interpretation alone, they are part of a broader moral framework that continues to exist across different paths. When we take all of this together, the picture becomes more balanced, because it shows that difference does not exist in isolation, it exists alongside connection. It exists within a larger structure where both unity and diversity are present at the same time. And understanding this balance is important, because it prevents the discussion from becoming one-sided, it prevents it from focusing only on what separates while ignoring what connects. However, it is also important not to lose sight of the distinctions that remain, because while there are shared elements, the definition of Jesus' nature continues to be a central point of difference. And this difference is not small, it shapes belief in a fundamental way, it influences how God is understood, how worship is directed, and how the relationship between the human and the divine is defined. Recognizing shared elements does not remove this distinction, it simply places it within a broader context. At this stage, the discussion becomes less about identifying who is right or wrong and more about understanding how these perspectives exist, how they developed, and how they continue to shape the lives of those who follow them. Because belief is not only about ideas, it is about identity, about belonging, about continuity, and these elements make it more complex than a simple comparison. There is also an important lesson here about how we approach difference itself, because the same difference can lead to two very different outcomes depending on perspective. It can lead to misunderstanding, to distance, to conflict, or it can lead to curiosity, to reflection, to a deeper understanding of both oneself and others. And this outcome is not determined by the difference alone, it is determined by how that difference is approached. When difference is approached with a desire to understand, it becomes an opportunity to see beyond assumptions, to explore ideas more deeply, to recognize the complexity of belief and the way it develops over time. But when it is approached with judgment, it becomes a barrier, something that limits understanding rather than expanding it. This is why this stage of the discussion is so important, because it shifts the focus from what divides to how we understand division, from the existence of difference to the way we respond to it. And this shift is not small, it changes the entire tone of the conversation. It moves it from confrontation to reflection, from argument to awareness. At the same time, returning to the principle of absolute oneness provides a point of clarity within this discussion, because it offers a consistent framework through which belief can be understood, a framework that maintains a clear distinction between creator and creation, that defines the role of prophets in a way that aligns with that distinction, and that preserves a direct relationship between the human and the divine. Within this framework, the understanding of Jesus as a prophet remains clear, consistent, and aligned with the foundational principle that governs everything else. And yet, even with this clarity, the presence of other perspectives remains, shaped by their own histories, their own interpretations, and their own frameworks of understanding, and recognizing this allows the discussion to remain balanced, to acknowledge both the clarity of one perspective and the existence of others without reducing the conversation to conflict. As everything begins to come together, it becomes clear that this topic is not only about defining a single figure, it is about understanding how belief forms, how it develops, how it becomes part of identity, and how it continues to shape the way people see the world. And this understanding extends beyond this specific discussion. It reflects a broader pattern of how human beings engage with faith, with meaning, and with the questions that define their existence. Because in the end, what remains is not only the difference itself, but the way that difference is understood, the way it is carried forward, and the way it shapes the lives of those who hold it. And when we understand this, the discussion moves beyond simple conclusions and into a deeper awareness, one that recognizes both the clarity of belief and the complexity of its development. And with that awareness, the final stage becomes possible, to bring everything together into a clear and meaningful conclusion, one that reflects not only what has been explored, but what it all means when seen as a whole, and how that understanding continues to matter in the present.